Have you ever stopped to think if you really know what democracy means? Or has the word become one of those terms that we repeat, almost like a mantra, without ever questioning what it really means? Today, everyone talks about democracy. It's democracy this, democracy that. They say we have to democratize the economy, culture, even our most intimate relationships. But do we understand the weight of this word? By extending it to all spheres of life, are we not actually emptying its deepest meaning? The truth is that we live in an era where the word democracy has become a free pass for all kinds of discourse, all kinds of manipulation. We use the term as if it were a kind of quality seal, without realizing that many times what we are doing is distorting the very concept it carries. And by doing so, we run the risk of turning democracy into a mask, into a farce, where the true meaning is lost amidst empty slogans and promises that are never fulfilled. And why? Because we forget that democracy is not an accessory, an ornament that we can hang on any aspect of life. It is a political regime, a structure that limits and defines the power of the state over individuals. When we try to democratize everything, we are actually giving more power to the state, handing over our privacy, our freedom, our rights on a silver platter. So, before being seduced by the pleasant sound of the word democracy, it is worth questioning. What are we really defending when we talk about social democracy, economic democracy, or worse still, sexual democracy? Are we expanding the true democratic spirit, or are we actually eroding its foundations? Democracy. Such a short word, but one that carries the weight of centuries of struggle, of spilled blood, of unattainable ideals and promises always postponed. Today, we use this word with the lightness of someone pronouncing something banal, every day, as if democracy were a kind of gentle breeze that hovers over our lives, never causing storms. But this is a naive, almost childish view that does not do justice to the complexity of what it really means to live under a democratic regime. Democracy is not an abstract concept, a vague idea that we can shape according to our desires or momentary needs. It is, above all, a political regime, a regime that is sustained by the existence of certain rights, guaranteed and protected by the state. And that is where the true power of democracy lies, in its ability to limit the power of the state itself. It is not a force that acts directly on people, but a structure that creates the necessary conditions for individual rights to be respected and preserved. But contrary to what many seem to believe, democracy is not something that a citizen or a company can practice on their own. It is not a personal virtue. It is not exemplary behavior. Democracy is what defines the relationship between the state and its citizens. It is the guarantee that the rules of the game are clear and equal for everyone, and only the state, with all its legal and political apparatus, can ensure that these rights are respected. When we talk about democracy, we are talking about the relationship between power and the individual, about the structure that puts the state in its proper place as a guardian and not a lord of rights. So, when we use the word democracy, we need to keep in mind that it does not refer to what we do in our daily lives, but to the system that enables those actions. What allows us to live in peace, work, express our opinions, is not an inherent goodness in people, but a legal framework that creates the conditions for it. It is the state that, by recognizing and protecting certain rights, makes democratic life possible. Outside of this framework, outside of this structure, what remains is the law of the strongest, anarchy, or, worse still, tyranny disguised as freedom. Therefore, when we talk about democracy, we are referring to a regime that paradoxically is both a force that limits and one that protects. And it is this tension, this delicate balance, that defines the true meaning of the word. Any attempt to extend democracy beyond its political legal domain is not an expansion, but a distortion, which ultimately threatens the very essence of what it means to be free. Metonymy, a term that, at first glance, seems confined to the world of figures of speech, distant from the concrete reality of our lives. But when we take a closer look, we realize that this rhetorical figure, which consists of using a word outside of its original context, has infiltrated our everyday discourse in a way that is almost imperceptible but profoundly insidious. And the use of the word democracy is one of the clearest and most dangerous examples of this practice. Democratic metonymy arises when we begin to use the word democracy to designate things that are not directly related to the political regime that it originally describes. This is how we started talking about social democracy, economic democracy, cultural democracy. What we are doing by using these terms is transferring the weight and seriousness of a political concept to areas where it does not belong, where it loses its original meaning and becomes a kind of verbal trick, form of manipulation. When we say that a company is practicing democracy by equalizing salaries, or that a social group is exercising democracy by fighting for equal rights, we are making a serious mistake, a semantic confusion that obscures the true nature of what democracy is. It is not these actions in themselves that are democratic. It is the political system that allows and protects these actions that is democratic. In other words, democracy does not reside in the act of equalizing salaries or fighting for equality, but in the legal framework that authorizes and protects these actions. By using the word democracy out of its context, we are actually doing a kind of inversion. We are putting individual action in the place of the system that supports it. Democratic metonymy is not just an innocent slip. It has profound and dangerous implications. Because, by making this transposition, we are expanding the reach of the state into areas of life that should remain outside of political control. In practice, we are politicizing everything, turning every aspect of life into a matter of the state, power, control. And this expansion of the democratic concept, which seems so benign on the surface, ends up eroding the very freedom democracy should protect. What started as a simple figure of speech, a metonymy, becomes a weapon of political manipulation. Everything becomes democratic, and yet nothing truly is. The word loses its value, its meaning dilutes, and what remains is a caricature, a shadow of what democracy should be. And when everything is democratized, in reality, nothing is truly free. By expanding the domain of democracy beyond its legitimate field, we are not extending its benefits, we are in fact contributing to its destruction. This democratic metonymy, which seems so harmless, is actually a dangerous illusion, a trap that leads us to passively accept the invasion of political power into all areas of our lives. And this, in the end, is not democracy. It is a distortion, perversion of its true spirit. When we talk about democratizing everything, we are playing with fire. What seems like a noble intention to extend the benefits of democracy to all aspects of life actually hides a dark threat. The idea of democratizing the economy, culture, or even human intimacy is, on the surface, deductive. Who wouldn't want to live in a world where everything is equal, where everyone has the same opportunities, the same rights, where there are no distinctions or hierarchy? But reality, as always, is much more complex and often much crueler. The expansion of the concept of democracy to spheres beyond its legitimate domain, the political legal, does not result in more freedom, but in less. By trying to democratize everything, we are actually politicizing everything. Every aspect of life, from how we earn our bread to the most intimate relationships, becomes subject to regulation, control. And what happens when everything is regulated? Freedom disappears, crushed under the weight of a state that extends in all directions, that infiltrates every corner of existence. This universalization of democracy is, in fact, the universalization of state power. The more we try to democratize, the more we are handing over to the state the power to decide what is or is not allowed, what is or is not acceptable. The boundaries between the public and the private dissolve, and what was once an individual choice becomes a matter of conformity to the norms imposed from top to bottom. What was meant to be an expression of freedom becomes a new form of servitude, one in which the state becomes the great arbiter of all human questions. Imagine a world where even your personal preferences, your cultural choices, or intimacy are subject to state approval, where what you read, what you watch, who you associate with, all of this becomes monitored and controlled in the name of a supposed democracy. It is not difficult to see how this can quickly turn into a totalitarian nightmare, where individuality is sacrificed on the altar of false equality. And this is the great danger of universal democratization. It destroys the very essence of democracy by extending it beyond its natural limits. Instead of protecting freedom, it suffocates it. Instead of guaranteeing rights, it turns them into privileges granted by a centralized and omnipresent power. What remains for us, then, is not a fairer or freer society, but a society in which authority is absolute, in which the state becomes the sole guardian and executor of an empty democracy, devoid of its true meaning. The truth is that not everything should be democratized. Not everything should be politicized. There are spheres of life that should remain untouched by state power, areas in which individual freedom, privacy, the right to be who we are, should prevail. The attempt to democratize everything is not an expansion of freedom, but an attack against it. And if we are not careful, if we do not recognize the natural limits of democracy, we run the risk of losing exactly what it should protect: our freedom to be, to think, to live, without the incessant interference of a state that considers itself capable of regulating every last detail of our existence. We have reached the crucial point of this journey of understanding, the limitation of democracy. In a time where the word democracy is used with an almost compulsive frequency, it is imperative to remember a fundamental truth. Democracy, however precious it may be, is not a panacea. It is not a universal remedy for all of humanity's ills. Democracy is essentially a political structure that limits the power of the state and protects the rights of the individual. And this limitation is not a flaw, but its greatest virtue. Democracy does not aim to regulate every aspect of human life. Its purpose is to ensure a space where freedom can flourish, where the individual can live without the constant interference of a central power. It is in the delimitation of this space that democracy finds its true value. But when we forget this limitation, when we begin to extend the democratic concept to spheres that do not belong to it, we end up destroying what it seeks to protect. By trying to democratize everything, we end up subverting the very principle that underpins democracy: protection against the excess of power. And ironically, in the pursuit of more democracy, what we achieve is an unprecedented concentration of power. The limitation of democracy, therefore, is not a weakness, but a necessity. It is necessary to recognize that democracy must be restricted to its natural field of action, the political legal domain. Outside of that, it loses its effectiveness. It becomes an empty label, a tool for the abuse of power. By accepting these limitations, we preserve the essence of democracy, its ability to protect individual freedom against the tyranny of the collective, against the absolute control of the state. This is the paradox that many fail to understand. More democracy, beyond its legitimate scope, does not result in more freedom, but in less. By expanding its application, we are only expanding the jurisdiction of the state over our lives, turning every aspect of existence into a political issue. And when everything is politicized, nothing is truly free. The true strength of democracy lies in recognizing its own limits, in knowing how far it can go without compromising the freedom it aims to protect. Believing that democracy can, or should, regulate all spheres of life is a fatal mistake, which inevitably leads to its own dissolution. Therefore, the final reflection is clear. For democracy to continue to serve its purpose, it is essential that it remains within the limits that define it. By recognizing these boundaries, we preserve the delicate balance between power and freedom, ensuring that democracy remains a system that protects rather than oppresses, that liberates rather than enslaves. This is the true challenge of our era: to remember that democracy, to be true, must be limited, and it is precisely in this limitation that its greatness resides. And here we are, at the end of this journey, with an uncomfortable but inevitable truth. Democracy, so praised, so desired, is not the solution to all human dilemmas. It is a powerful tool, yes, but also dangerous if misused. By recognizing its limits, we are not weakening democracy, but strengthening it, preserving its true essence. The question that remains is, how far are we willing to go in the name of democracy? Do we blindly accept the expansion of this concept, allowing it to invade every aspect of our lives? Or do we have the courage to draw the line, to say enough, to understand that true freedom only exists within certain limits? This is the choice that defines not only the future of democracy, but the future of our own freedom. Because in the end, democracy is a double-edged sword. In one hand, it protects, in the other, it can destroy. And it is up to us, as conscious individuals, as citizens of a democratic state, to decide which side of this blade we will sharpen. May we choose wisely, understanding that sometimes the most democratic act we can perform is precisely to restrict democracy to its rightful limits. Only then will we ensure that it continues to be an instrument of freedom and not of oppression.